Our last section focused on the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mi'kmaq, three of the many people who originally lived in North America. Now, this next section is going to focus on the French and British explorers who began to arrive in the late 1400s and early 1500s. They established an era of permanent contact with the First Nations and Inuit people living here in Canada, and it set changes in motion that still shape Canada even to this day. In the 1300s, overland trade routes between Europe and Asia became disrupted. The huge Mongol Empire, which had supported and protected these routes, started to decline. As it lost power to the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and the Ming Dynasty in China, the routes became vulnerable to attack and more dangerous to travel. The disruption of trade with Asia drove up the price of Asian silk and spices in Europe. Prices went up because of supply and demand. As the supply of these goods diminished, Europe's demand for them remained high. Some people in Europe saw this as an opportunity. If they could secure a supply of trade goods from Asia, they could make a fortune. The economic opportunity created by disrupted land routes also created a challenge. How could Europeans reach Asia if they didn't travel by land? Well, if you didn't travel by land, your only other option was to travel by sea. Europeans had ships, as did people in China, the Middle East, and India. But travel by sea had many risks. Ships were slow, and they were difficult to steer. If you lost sight of land, it was easy to get lost. Bad weather could end your journey and your life. In addition, people at the time believed that the world was flat. Can you imagine yourself as a sailor in the 1300s? How might this affect the way you viewed the risks of sea travel? For almost a century, the problems posed by sea travel prevented Europeans from establishing new trade routes to Asia. During the 1400s, Europeans began to design ships that were faster and easier to maneuver. They also started to use navigational instruments developed by the ancient Greeks and by Arab and Chinese sailors: the compass and the astrolabe. A compass, of course, tells you your direction of travel. With an astrolabe, you can estimate your location using the sun or the stars. The Portuguese were the first to put the new ships and instruments to use. They decided to sail east to find Asia. Considering their concepts of geography, do you think this made sense? The Portuguese knew that an eastern sea route to Asia did not lie through the Mediterranean Sea because the Mediterranean was well known and well mapped. An eastern sea route, if there was one, might lie south of the Mediterranean around Africa somehow. In 1488, a Portuguese explorer, Bartolomeu Dias, rounded Africa's southern tip, the Cape of Good Hope. Soon, Portuguese ships began arriving in India. The Portuguese did not want other Europeans to follow them and share the rich trade in Asian goods. They did their best to control the eastern sea route to Asia. Was there another way to Asia? Well, Christopher Columbus thought so. He thought that he could sail west to find the east. Columbus was an Italian sailor, but he was also a businessman and an adventurer. Like someone today with a big idea and no money, he looked for sponsors to back him. In 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to put up the money for his expedition. They made a deal with Columbus. If he succeeded in finding Asia, Spain would take 90% of the profits he made, and Columbus could keep the rest. Columbus, of course, didn't find Asia. He landed in the Caribbean. From there, Spanish explorers traveled into Central America and South America, where they found the gold of the Aztec and Incan empires. They plundered the gold and enslaved the people to work in the mines. Gold from the Americas made Spain the most powerful country in Europe at that time. After the voyages of Columbus, Britain, France, and the Netherlands became interested in Western exploration. Because Spain controlled the route to the Caribbean, these countries concentrated on more northern routes. They often chose Italian navigators to head up their ventures into the unknown waters of the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, Italy dominated Europe's trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea, so Italian navigators had become the most experienced sailors in Europe. In 1497, an English expedition led by Italian sailor and merchant Giovanni Caboto landed in Newfoundland and claimed it for Britain. Caboto returned to Europe with reports of seas so full of cod you could scoop fish up by the basketful. Soon, ships from Europe began to fish off the east coast of what became Canada. The ships arrived in summer and went home in winter, only coming to shore to dry their catch and replenish their supplies of fresh water. On shore, they met the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk, among other peoples of the East Coast, with both positive and some negative results. Do you ever trade things with your friends? When you trade something, you generally weigh the advantage of keeping what you have with the advantage of gaining something new. So, what do you think makes a good trade? Or what makes a bad one? Well, starting in the late 1400s, following the British expedition of Giovanni Caboto, the Mi'kmaq came into regular contact with Europeans fishing off the east coast of Canada. When the Mi'kmaq and Europeans began to encounter each other, they weighed the advantages of trading too. Europe had a high demand for fish, so catching cod to sell in Europe made good, reliable profits. What about furs? Would furs sell too? Some First Nations seemed willing to trade for them. Europe had fur-bearing animals of its own, though, and a really established fur trade with Russia. Would furs from this new source compete? It was worth a try, as long as it didn't cost too much to get them. Maybe furs would turn into a profitable sideline, in addition to the cod. The Mi'kmaq viewed trading as a way to establish good relations with other people. The giving and receiving of gifts showed respect and goodwill. When the Mi'kmaq began trading with Europeans, this relationship building would have been uppermost in their minds. European goods also had advantages for the Mi'kmaq. The Europeans traded metal goods, which the Mi'kmaq found very useful. For old beaver furs, the Mi'kmaq could easily replace. The Europeans preferred old furs, furs the Mi'kmaq had worn. The long outer hair had fallen off these furs, leaving the fuzzy underfur exposed. In Europe, hat makers used this underfur to make felt. The Mi'kmaq traded what was to them old clothes for metal knives, axes, pots, kettles, and needles. They valued these European goods because the goods were durable and useful. For example, with the metal pots, the Mi'kmaq could cook directly over fires instead of cooking food in containers using rocks heated in fires. The new method was faster, and it used less firewood. The Mi'kmaq could meet their needs with fewer resources and less trouble. The Beothuk people lived in Newfoundland and, like the Mi'kmaq, encountered the Europeans who came to fish cod in the 1500s. The Beothuk and the Europeans, however, did not establish a very friendly trading relationship. The question is, why not? Well, historians actually find this question difficult to answer because the truth is, no Beothuk people survive to this day. The oral history of the Mi'kmaq people records some information about their culture, as do European histories. So here's what we know. With imperialism as their starting point, the French and British did not question whether they had the right to set up fishing camps and settlements in Newfoundland. Some of these camps and settlements interfered with traditional fishing areas that the Beothuk needed for their survival. The Beothuk took equipment from French and British fishing camps, perhaps to encourage the French and British to leave. But this ended up leading to conflict between the Beothuk and the Europeans. In 1713, Newfoundland became a British colony, and more British settlers began to arrive. More conflict resulted. This, plus other factors such as loss of their food supply and European diseases, led to the extinction of the Beothuk. In the early 1800s, the British settlers in Newfoundland began trying to establish friendly relations with the Beothuk, but the Beothuk avoided contact. The British responded by capturing Beothuk people, intending to give them gifts and make them messengers of peace. Well, these attempts began to end violently and failed as a result. In 1823, British trappers captured a young woman named Shonadithit, along with her sister and her mother. Shonadithit's father drowned trying to come to the women's rescue. The trappers brought the women to St. John's, where the British gave them gifts and returned them to their point of capture. Shonadithit's mother and sister soon died, and Shonadithit was unable to contact her people, and so she ended up walking back to St. John's. In 1828, one of the British settlers, William Cormack, realized the Beothuk would soon completely disappear. With Shonadithit, he tried to create a record of the Beothuk culture and history, but he didn't speak her language, and she was already dying of tuberculosis. Shonadithit died in 1829, and she was the very last of her people.